Jambo. I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and the Children of Kush publications. These two organizations are dedicated to creating a paradigm shift in Black thought, as well as to advance the cause of Black liberation around the globe. This is the third presentation that I'm doing. You would recall that the first presentation was just a general introduction of the Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and the Children of Kush publications, where we talked about some of the aims and objectives. And you would recall that we said that our modus operandi, or the way in which we operate, includes writing articles which are circulated among people here in the Caribbean and in the wider diaspora. We also put videos on social media and, of course, through our books. And you will notice I will continue to remind you of the series of books which are published by Afro-Caribbean Teaching Center, or rather, I should have said, through the Children of Kush publications. And this series of books entitled Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. There are 6 books in this series, and they're all available on Amazon Kindle. Now, in the first presentation that we did in this series, as I said, was just an introduction. And then in the last one, we started looking at the subject of God, where we looked at God from the African perspective. And we made some very interesting points, including the fact that the African concept of God is as sophisticated and as meaningful as the concept of God that is held by just about every other group of people, including Europeans, Jews, and Muslims. In this week's broadcast, I propose to focus on the view of God that is held by the Abrahamic faith. And I am zeroing in on the Abrahamic faith because it is mainly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that have had the greatest impact on both the continent of Africa and on Africans in the diaspora. So we want to focus on that in this broadcast, as well as I will be doing a brief critique of the God concept of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, in my last broadcast, you would recall I mentioned the name of Dr. Arikana Chikambari Kwo. And I made mention of the fact that she has conceived of a plan to create a number of Wakandan cities of excellence all around the continent of Africa. Now, it seems as though what Dr. Chikambari Kwo intends to do is to create a number of cities in the continent of Africa. And these cities are supposed to be very high-tech, futuristic cities. I did mention that she had mentioned Zimbabwe as one of the places. But as I went back, I realized that the plan is to have a Wakandan futuristic city in all of the cardinal points on the continent of Africa, which would mean in Southern Africa, where Zimbabwe and Zambia were earmarked. On the east coast of Africa, Tanzania is the country that is earmarked for one of these Wakandan cities. I think in Central Africa, Equatorial Guinea is the site that is being looked at as a possible site for a Wakandan city in Central Africa. And Morocco, there's some talk about doing one of these cities also in Morocco. And then on the West Coast, Ghana seems to be the place where they are thinking of putting one of these Wakandan cities. As a matter of fact, as I did a little bit more research, I discovered that there is a nexus between Dr. Chikambori's plans for Wakandan cities and the government of Ghana, which is also thinking of creating a city of return for people in the diaspora. I was listening to a presentation in which Dr. Chikambori made the point that the Prime Minister of, or the President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, approached her with his plans for building a city of return along the Cape Coast in Africa. So there seemed to be some coordination of plans between Dr. Chikambori and the government of Ghana. You understand that land has already been earmarked in Ghana for this Wakandan city of return. Now, those of us who are familiar with the history of the slave trade would remember that the Cape Coast area, that's where you have the Elmina Castle and the Cape Coast Castle. Well, they're called castles, but they were really dungeons where slaves were held after they'd been marched right across the continent of Africa. And the Cape Coast was basically the last place in Africa that our ancestors would have seen, because it was there from Elmina and the Cape Castle that most of our ancestors would have been transported across the Atlantic into the Caribbean and the Americas. So it is an interesting choice of location in Ghana, the last place that our ancestors would have seen. This is the site that both the government of Ghana and Dr. Chikambori have chosen as a site for one of their futuristic Wakandan cities of excellence. We hope, of course, that all these plans materialize and that eventually we can have some very beautiful cities that would help to boost the tourism on the continent of Africa. In reading, I also discovered that the singer Akon is also thinking of creating a Wakandan futuristic city in Senegal. So we hope that that plan also would come to fruition. Now, I don't know if I should say unfortunately, but apparently there are no plans of building any futuristic cities in the Caribbean. I was a little amused, however, when I read in the BLP manifesto that Barbados may be thinking of utilizing some of its coastal territory. The manifesto reminded us, and I think it is accurate, that the coastal regions surrounding Barbados, we have more territorial waters than we actually have land. And so the idea has been tossed out that Barbados could perhaps think in terms of developing a series of islands, which would not be a bad idea. Other countries have done it. They've dredged the sea, they've gotten a lot of sand and rocks, and they've built a lot of artificial islands. It's a feasible thing. Who knows, maybe one of these artificial islands that will be built by Barbados at some time in the future could become a futuristic city. But until we get to that point, I'm thinking that there are lots of things that governments in the Caribbean could do to advance the living standards of Barbadians, and not just Barbadians, of Caribbean people, and to bring the Caribbean into the future as well. And one of the things that I really hope that Caribbean governments would consider, and it is not an idea that is being pulled out of the clouds. It's something that actually some governments are already doing, that is providing free Wi-Fi for its citizens. Now, as I said, some people may think that this is wishful thinking about governments providing free Wi-Fi, but this is already something that is happening in some parts of the world. Now, there are a number of telecommunication companies that are developing new technologies to deliver Wi-Fi, especially to people who live in rural areas where you may not have the infrastructure, the telephone services, you may not have that kind of infrastructure. So a number of companies, including SpaceX, OneWeb, and Amazon, they have been, they're experimenting on currently exploring internet access using satellite constellations in low Earth orbit. Now, if successful, these projects could be a template for Caribbean governments to follow in pursuit of offering free Wi-Fi throughout the Caribbean. And I'm thinking, if you can have companies that are owned privately by individuals who can succeed with their plans of offering Wi-Fi through satellites, why can't Caribbean governments come together and invest in the launching of a communication satellite, which would then be able to provide free Wi-Fi access for people throughout the Caribbean? It is not impossible. It is something that can be done. But of course, it will require a certain amount of vision. And as I have said in all two of the previous sessions, where there is no vision, the people will perish. People will perish for a lack of knowledge. We're going to take a break at this point. When I return, I will be looking at the Abrahamic faith, the concept of God in the Abrahamic faith, and also doing a brief critique of the concept of God as held by the three Abrahamic faiths. See you shortly. Welcome back. Let's start by doing a review of some of the main points that would have been made in the previous presentation so that we can make a connection between the two presentations. In the previous presentation, we said that traditional African religion has a very sophisticated view of God, the Creator. We also said our African ancestors were not primitive devil-worshipping heathens. We made the point that Europeans did not introduce the concept of God to our African ancestors. And number four, we made the point that Europeans simply introduced European culture clothed in religious garbs. So now that we've done that quick review of some of the main points that were made in the last presentation, let's proceed into today's presentation. And we're looking at the concept of God in the Abrahamic faiths. So let's first look at what we mean when we say the Abrahamic faiths. Now, the Abrahamic faiths are basically faiths that draw their historical validity from the lives of the patriarchs that are found in the Old Testament. And these three faiths are mainly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, all three of these faiths rely on the history of the patriarchal narrative. So they believe in Abraham, they believe in Moses, they believe in many of the characters that can be found in the Old Testament. Now, all three of these Abrahamic faiths, they all have a similar concept of God. They believe that God is one being. And perhaps I should also make the point that there's a slight distinction in the monotheism of Jews and Muslims and the monotheism of Christians. Now, Jews and Muslims are what you may call strict monotheists. They believe that God is one being, according to the Shema, which is found in the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So Jews and Muslims believe that God is one being. That's strict monotheism. Christians believe in what I like to call monotheism light, in that, yes, Christians say they are monotheists, but with an explanation. And the explanation stems from the fact that Christians also believe not only in God the Father, but they also believe that Jesus is God, and they also believe that the Holy Spirit is God. So in accordance with the orthodox statement of the Trinity doctrine, Christians believe that God the Father is God lacking nothing. Jesus is God lacking nothing. The Holy Spirit is God lacking nothing. Now, if all three of them are God lacking nothing, then I fail to understand how Christians can then come back and say there is just one God. That's like holding up three fingers and then trying to convince me that it is one God. So I like to tell people that the Christian concept of God is basically a square circle, something that really and truly cannot exist and is very illogical. But that's how Christians view God. He is a composite unity of three in one. And I should say that both Jews and Muslims reject that concept outright, and they refer to Christians as tritheists, meaning that they believe in three gods, and one cannot possibly see how that charge against Christians can be denied. But by and large, all three of the Abrahamic faiths make the claim that they are monotheists. Now, just like our African ancestors, the Abrahamic faiths have some of the very same concepts of God that we looked at when we talked about the African concept of God. And I'll just quickly remind you what were some of the things that we talked about. We said in the African context that God was omnipotent, he was omniscient, he was omnipresent, he was omnibenevolent, he was immanent, he was transcendent, he was self-existing, and he was eternal. All of these are concepts which are also shared by the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Now, if one were to do a little comparison between the African concept and the Abrahamic faith concept, a very interesting question that could be raised is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, Judaism makes the claim of being the oldest of the Abrahamic faiths. I know that some Muslims actually challenge that particular statement, but from a historical perspective, it seems as though Judaism is the oldest of the three Abrahamic faiths. Now, the question is, where exactly did the Israelites or the Jews get their religious concepts from? Now, it's interesting when you go back into the Old Testament. You'll find the story of Joseph going down into Egypt, which I should remind you, that's Africa. And then the narrative talks about a great famine that came over the land of Canaan, which then resulted in Isaac and the rest of Jacob's brothers and sisters coming down into Egypt, where they were given a plot of land in Goshen. And then centuries went by, we found that the Israelite nation becoming a great nation, so great that, according to the story, the pharaohs of Egypt began to fear that if there was a war, that the Egyptians might join themselves on to the enemies and so create problems for the Egyptian nation. So the point I'm getting at is that the nation of Israel had its origins in Africa. The founder of Judaism, or the great one who led out in the formation of all of the Old Testament laws and their sanctuary services and all of that, was Moses. Now, the Bible tells us that Moses was schooled in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. So in terms of which came first, I seem to think that maybe the African concept of God may have preceded even the Jewish concept of God. And it is quite possible that the Jews, because of the fact that they had close proximity to our ancestors in Egypt, that they would have learned quite a bit. The question of the origin of monotheism. Those of us who are familiar with some Egyptian history would know that long before the Jews started talking about monotheism, the concept of monotheism was already present among the Egyptians. Akhenaten was one of the great African ancestors who introduced the concept of monotheism, and that was before the time of Moses. I just thought I would throw that in there for your consideration. So basically, the Abrahamic faith, the concept of God, is very similar to the African concept. And as I just hinted, it is quite possible that the Abrahamic faith's concept of God could have been influenced by our African ancestors. Now, let's look at some more characteristics of the creator God of the Abrahamic faiths. Just like the Africans, it was believed that God lived in the sky, he lived in heaven. Now, there's a very curious bit of information that I came across while examining the whole subject of the evolution of thought about God among various nations. And it would appear that in very ancient times, perhaps going back to the times when the first ancestors of man may have lived in caves, there was the notion that the deity lived in a sacred cave. And the sacred cave could only be entered by the chief religious spokesmen and women of the gods. Only these initiated people could enter into these sacred caves. But human beings, being the curious things that we are, eventually the people decided that they wanted to see what was going on in these sacred caves. And so many people would enter these sacred caves only to be disappointed by the conspicuous absence of the gods. And so the next part of the evolution of our thinking about God came as we then transported God into the high places. So you would read a lot in ancient mythology about people going up into mountains and meeting with gods who lived in the mountains. In the Old Testament, there's this story of Moses going up into Mount Sinai, where he is supposed to have met with the God of the Jews. So there was this concept of high places, that God resided in high places. Now, again, as people ascended up into the heights and they went into these sacred mountains, again, they found that the mountains conspicuously absent of the gods. So the people who were responsible for perpetuating the stories of the gods then shifted and said, okay, the gods live in the skies. They live in the heavens. And that's where we are at right now. We believe that God lives in heaven. But it's interesting now that as we enter into the space age, and we're able to launch satellites and the Hubble telescope and probes which go into deep outer space. One wonders what will be discovered. Will we discover God in outer space? Or will we discover, just like how the ancients discovered the caves and the mountains conspicuously absent of God, will we also find God conspicuously absent in outer space? Well, that's a question that science, no doubt, will help us to answer at some point, no doubt. So, like our African ancestors, the Abrahamic faiths also believe that God resides in the skies or in the heavens or paradise, and it's all upward activity. Like our ancestors also, the Abrahamic faith believes that God is a spirit, the creator is a spirit. And this is spelled out in no uncertain terms in the scriptures of both the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. God is a spirit. In terms of his character, again, we find God to be merciful, to be kind, to be helpful to humanity. We find God to be one who provides comfort to humanity in suffering. God is considered to be good. He's the essence of goodness. He both creates and destroys, just like how the Africans believe. And God can become angry. As a matter of fact, when the wrath of God is incurred, you can look for all kinds of plagues to befall the people who have angered God. They can be floods, they can be droughts, they can be locusts, they can be all kinds of natural disasters. So basically what we are seeing here is total similarity between the African concept of God and the concept of God which is presented by the Abrahamic faiths. Now, one of the big differences that we mention between the African religion and the religion of the Abrahamic faiths is that in African religion, there are no significant temples and there are no scriptures. And someone reminded me, and it just came back to my mind that I should have said that in Africa, the only place where you would have found elaborate temples, I did mention Egypt, but I also should have mentioned Ethiopia. There are some massive stone churches that were built in Ethiopia. I think the place is Lalibela. And of course, in Mali, you have the Great Mud Mosque. But apart from these three places, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Mali, most African groups would have preferred not to build these elaborate temples. And of course, they would not have had any books of scripture, unless, of course, they were influenced by Christians and Muslims, and maybe Jews as well. Now, the presence of holy books or writings which purport to either be inspired by the deity of the Abrahamic faith or, as in the case of the Quran, written by the deity of the Muslims. The presence of these books provides us with a whole lot more information upon which we can do an assessment of the God of the Abrahamic faith. So it is on that basis that I'm doing a deeper analysis of the God of the Abrahamic faith than I did of the God in the African concept. Now, there are a group of thinkers, they have been dubbed the New Atheists, even though Richard Dawkins objects to the term New Atheist. on the basis that they're simply saying the same things that atheists have been saying all along. But this group who have been dubbed the New Atheists include the late Christopher Hitchens. I think Christopher Hitchens died somewhere around 2011. I think he died of cancer. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dannett, and the lone woman in the group, Ayan Hershey Ali. They have become some very influential voices in opposing superstition, religion, and irrationalism. The term New Atheist was given to them by a journalist, Gary Wolf, and what they basically do is they advocate, they counter, they criticize, and challenge all religious claims. I will have more to say about Hitchens, Dawkins, and the others in my next presentation, which will focus on the concept of God from a secular scientific perspective. Now, the contemporary atheists use both the Bible and the Quran to launch some of their strongest attacks against the God concept of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, in his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins writes, and I quote, he says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully." And that's from page 51 of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Now, clearly from that quote, you would know that Richard Dawkins is no fan of the God of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, Christopher Hitchens develops the same theme of divine malevolence in his book, God is Not Good. Sam Harris, like Hitchens, argues that religion contributes to all of the mayhem, confusion, and madness going on in the world today. And Sam Harris's book is The End of Faith. Now, in my book, Is God a Moral Monster?, I explore some of the valid arguments put forward by the so-called New Atheists. People of faith will no doubt be offended by some of the conclusions I have arrived at in my book. But as I argue, a bad God is infinitely worse than no God at all. Now, in the US, they just remembered January 6th, the events of January 6th, 2021, when a group of religiously motivated Trump supporters besieged the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. to interfere with the electoral process. The goal of this religiously motivated mob was to overturn the results of the American election so that Donald Trump would get a second term in office. And the reason why so many religious people in America were involved in this besieging of Capitol Hill was the fact that many of them felt that somehow Trump had been specially chosen by God to advance the cause of Christian nationalism in America and by extension into the rest of the world. So there were lots of Christian symbols on display as this mob eventually ransacked the Capitol building on January 6th. For those who have forgotten, it was reported in the Trump victory, when Trump actually won the presidency, it was reported that as high as 81% of white evangelicals in North America voted for Trump. And so white evangelicals are in the vanguard of Christian nationalism. It should be pointed out that not all white evangelicals are Christian nationalists, but many evangelicals do constitute the vanguard of Christian nationalism in North America. Now, Black evangelicals who tend to share the same conservative values as white evangelicals, they may have parted company with white evangelicals on the support of President Trump. But because of the fact that Black evangelicals share a lot of the same conservative values, it means that there is a lot of commonality in thinking. And it would be interesting to discover or to find out the true extent of the support of Black evangelicals for the agenda of Donald Trump. If you take, for example, the Ben Carson factor. Now, Ben Carson is a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is a conservative Protestant denomination. It is not considered to be radical in any sense of the word, but the mere fact that you have a high-ranking Black Seventh-day Adventist in the Trump cabinet may very well suggest that there is a leaning among Seventh-day Adventists for some of the more conservative aspects of the Trump agenda. And I said all that to say that Black Christians, especially Black evangelical Christians, may find that it is very hard for them because of the religious orientation that they are surrounded by to break free of that kind of Christian nationalist thinking entirely. Now, the involvement of militant Christian nationalists in the siege on the Capitol Hill on January 6 in the US should serve as a warning that it is not only Islamic fundamentalists who are capable of terrorist activity. I think it was a few days back, there was an interview with one of the American senators who had actually went on record, Ted Cruz, I think it was, he had went on record calling the people who sieged the Capitol on January 6th, he called them terrorists. But then he was on Tucker Carlson's show just recently trying to pull back that particular statement. Now, of course, when the whole world watches cross-toting terrorists actually engaging in the same kind of activities as we saw on January 6th in the capital of the US, it pretty much feeds into the narrative of new atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, who are on record stating that religious faith actually contributes and is a catalyst for that kind of militant behavior. Now, I suspect that it is the political posturing of the religious right in America that has motivated atheists and others to raise their voice in protest. Now, the protests are not only aimed at religion, but the protests are also aimed at the God concept, which seems to be motivating a lot of the religious activity. Now, there's a maxim that suggests that people will become like those whom they admire most. Since Christians are supposed to admire God, it stands to reason that in their admiration of God, they will try to mirror his behavior. So now that leads us into perhaps the most challenging aspect of this presentation. What behaviors are they which are mentioned in the scriptures of those who practice the Abrahamic faiths that may lend itself to some of the malevolent forms of behavior that we see manifested among militant Christian nationalists. Is there a connection? I think there's a connection. Now let's look at what is said about the God of the Abrahamic faiths in the scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths. Right in the early part of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we find God engaged in a massive extinction event called the flood, in which God, because of the bad behavior of the human family at that time, according to the Bible story, the narrative of the flood says that God decided that he would wipe out the entire nation of mankind, everybody. But not only did God decide to kill out all of mankind, he also decided to kill out the animals as well. And of course, that causes one to wonder what exactly the poor animals would have done to have deserved this massive extinction event that came upon them. Now, I kind of like watching certain movies, and I really did enjoy the two last Marvel Avenger movies, which were looking at the story of Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet series. And it is interesting that the Titan Thanos decided that there needed to be a certain amount of balance in the universe. So what Thanos decided was that he needed to exterminate half life across the universe. And so Thanos came up with this idea. He snapped his finger and half of all life would just evaporate. There would be no suffering, there would be no burning, there would be no drowning, nothing like that. You just disappeared. It was quick, it was efficient. Now, when you look at that and you compare the way in which the God of the Bible engages in his extinction events, using floods, using fire, using comets falling, well, I shouldn't say comets, asteroids falling on people and killing them, using pestilence, using earthquakes and other natural disasters. That is what you would expect of a less sophisticated being in terms of their thought patterns. Thanos snapped his finger and they were gone. That should have been a snap, pardon the pun, for an omnipotent, omniscient being. But we find, just like in the Babylonian myths and in the Assyrian myths, we find about the gods destroying man with a flood. And this is the same kind of narrative that is basically expounded on in the book of Genesis, which then raises the question, are we dealing with divine revelation, or are we dealing with stories that are being perpetrated in the name of some invisible deity? So we find God killing on a massive scale. We find God sanctioning genocide. The settlement of Canaan was basically predicated on the genocide of the Canaanites, the whole destruction of Jericho and all the other destructions of the people who lived in Canaan prior to the Israelis, the exodus of the Israelis from Egypt. We find also that there is a sanction of slavery. And this is a very interesting one. I said that we would talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But many Christians seem to think that the slavery that is sanctioned in the Bible is the same thing as indentured labor, where they were said that a Jew, if because of debt, could sell himself to somebody, and according to the book of the law, the Jew who sold himself could only be in bondage for a period of 6 years. In the 7th year, they were supposed to be liberated and they were supposed to be sent out with reparations. In other words, the person who had the Jew in his possession, who the Jew sold himself to, Not only were they supposed to liberate the Jew in the 7th year, but they were supposed to send them out with substance. They were supposed to give them reparations for their labor of servitude, which is very different to the slavery that was practiced by the Jews on the inhabitants of Canaan. The Jews were told that they could make slaves of the people from the nations surrounding them. They could buy slaves from the nations that surrounded them. Not only could they buy slaves from the people that surrounded them, they could also pass on these slaves from one generation to another. In other words, the slaves were an inheritance. There was no concept of the liberation of these non-Jewish slaves after 7 years. The whole concept of the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth did not apply to non-Jews. If a Jew knocked out a slave's eye, there was no comparative knocking out of the Jew's eyes for that. So there was a distinction made between Jewish indentured servant, which is correct, and the slavery that was practiced and sanctioned by the God of the Jews. We also find that the God of the Abrahamic faiths was very homophobic. The solution to men or women engaging in homosexuality was death. That was the solution. And I guarantee you that if many of the practitioners of the Abrahamic faiths were allowed to constitute the government and the laws of many countries, what we are seeing in Afghanistan, Iran, and other places where you have Sharia law, Islamic Sharia law being imposed on the population. If Christians, Christian nationalists were to form governments, we would see the exact same thing, because the holy books of the Quran and the Old Testament have the same solutions for people who deviate from the moral line which is prescribed in these holy books. Death, mainly. We also find that the God of the Abrahamic faith sanctions the killing of apostates. Among Jews, Jews were told anybody who basically motivated another Jew to join themselves onto another God, that person was supposed to be killed. The same thing is true among Muslims, and some Christians will probably tell you that that is a very good thing as well. We also have sanctions on killing for those who violate religious holidays, namely the Sabbath. And of course, we find that the God of the Abrahamic faith had a favorite or a chosen nation. And of course, this concept of a chosen nation basically feeds into the concept of racism, because if my nation is a nation that is chosen by God, it means that my nation is better than your nation, and somehow my nation should rule over your nation. So that's where that concept of the white man's burden or the Jewish right to take over all of Palestine, because after all, the Jews are God's chosen people, and God gave the land of Palestine to the Jews. Now, this brief character sketch helps us to understand why practitioners of the Abrahamic faith were and continue to be very comfortable with religious wars, genocide of those of a different faith, slavery, racial discrimination, homophobia, misogyny, discrimination against women, religious persecution of apostates and others, forcing people to obey certain religious laws like Sabbath laws, and of course racism, and things like having one nation declared as being superior to all other nations. All of these are things which stem from the understanding among people in the Abrahamic faiths as how their God actually behaves and thinks. And because they are supposed to admire and imitate their God, we see the very same forms of behavior being practiced by those people within the Abrahamic traditions. So what are the takeaway points from this presentation? The God of Abrahamic faiths is similar to the God of our African ancestors. So there are similarities between the two. However, the holy books of the Abrahamic faiths provide us with much more information. And this information then allows us to do a better critique of the God of the Abrahamic faiths. Using the holy books of the Abrahamic faiths, the new atheists have concluded that the God of the Abrahamic faiths is malevolent and evil. The siege on Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021 reminds us that militant Christian nationalism can be just as violent as any Islamic fundamentalist group. Practitioners of the Abrahamic faiths are merely irritating their God when they're engaged in holy wars, genocide, slavery, homophobia, misogyny, gender discrimination, religious persecution, enforcing religious laws, and engaging in racism, elitism, or chauvinism of any kind. So what then can we conclude by what I presented in this presentation? The scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths gives us much more material to critique and to analyze the God concept of those who practice these faiths. The new atheists and others have pointed out that the character of the God of the Abrahamic faith leaves much to be desired and is the motivating factor for many malevolent forms of behavior practiced by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. As such, therefore, the God concept of the Abrahamic faiths is neither superior or better than the God concept of the Africans. If we can agree that the God concept of the Abrahamic faiths is not superior to or better than the God concept of the Africans, this should lead us to conclude that there's absolutely no reason for African peoples, whether we are dealing with Africans on the continent or we're dealing with Africans in the diaspora, to discard the concept of our African ancestors, to discard the religion of our African ancestors in favor of the God concept and the religion of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. In my next presentation, I will further explore the God concept, but this time I will look at the God concept through the eyes of secular science. Feel free to like, share this video with your contacts both in the African diaspora and on the continent of Africa. Asante sana na kwaheri, which is Kiswahili for thank you very much and goodbye.